나무 묘호랭개교 나무 묘호랭개교 나무 묘호랭개교 Namo Myoho Renge Kyo. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting this channel, liking and subscribing, especially so important to our propagation of Nichiren's doctrine of Shakyamuni's teachings of the Lotus Sutra. And we are talking about Nichiren's lifetime. And looks like this camera moved a little bit. Oops, did that go too far? That looks pretty good. Okay, so we started with part one of a reprint from Forgotten Books. A Harvard professor speaking on the lifetime of Nichiren. So, yes, it's obviously, if it's about Nichiren, it's about Buddhism, but what's fascinating about this is it gives us a broader context for all of Nichiren's writing, right? The Gosho. And so we get to hear, and in all my lectures on the Gosho, of course, I try to put us in situ, if you will, in the situation of his day, because Nichiren does spend a lot of time in the Gosho talking about the forces that, by forces, I don't mean woo, I mean the samurai, the government, the oppression, the totalitarian, authoritarian regime that he was living under, and the pressures on the average Japanese citizen, whether they were merchants or farmers or part of the inner circles of government or landowners. All of those stratuses of the society had different pressures put upon them by what was essentially a military government. They were living in a military state, yeah? And the samurai would rove through your towns and come through on their way to maybe battle somebody or discipline somebody. Certainly, if you were practicing Nichiren Buddhism, you weren't practicing the state religion, so we could rape your women and take your land and do whatever the hell we want. And I'm a samurai, and I know I wake up every morning rededicating myself to the idea of Bushido code that today's my last day on earth, so you know, what are you going to do to me? Right? You start to consider those things and how daily life might be in medieval Japan. You start to consider Nichiren as like, dude, you're not in today's world, we'd say he's courageous, but in his world, they might look at him as like, are you crazy? You know, he invited, really invited, although that wasn't his purpose, all manner of discipline on himself. He was almost beheaded, right? He was supposed to be beheaded. It didn't work out that way, which is an auspicious thing, yeah. But exiled twice to go die somewhere, survives, comes back, kind of hides out in Minobu. By that time, he's older. He's not as spry. So he doesn't hide out in fear of his own life. He hides out, not really hides out, but he picks a very remote location in Japan to spend his remaining years to develop his disciples, his closest senior inner circle, to propagate what he's been his whole life spending every effort of every day to propagate Lotus Sutra Buddhism. Yeah. So we read the first chapter, reproduction of an autographed manuscript by Nichiren. So we can see Nichiren's hand in this image here. If I can get it to, no, there we go. No, I probably should do that. Oops, upside down. So that's by Nichiren's hand, and I apologize for my shaking left arm. Neck problems. At any rate, so this chapter we're going to this author, over 100-year-old text from Harvard University research, he calls his time. So this author from, what did we say, 1916? So this book took quite some time to come about. So it's the knowledge in this book from this professor starts from the 19th century into the 20th century. The publication doesn't come out till 1916, which itself is over 100 years ago. Yeah. So the scholarship of Buddhism, make no mistake, it's no recent activity. It's been going on for a long time. So let's read about this author's impression of, and right off the bat I can tell you there's still to this day argumentation about when Shakyamuni was actually, because of calendar changes and, you know, lunar calendars, King James, whatever calendars, medieval calendars, there's still this unrest about actual dates. But that's not what we're trying to read here. We're trying to read about, you know, who is this guy Nichiren and what was the context of his life as he wrote all these Gosho that we study, yeah? So, it starts with, and since they put Buddha's death in 949 BC, they believe that the last of the three ages began in the year 1052 AD. 24 years after the death of the regent Michinaga, with whom the pomp and splendor of the court life in Miyako reached its culmination. So here's the debate, right? Did Shakyamuni die in 949 BC? Some put it more close to 500 BC in that time period. So there's a fluidity of 400 or 500 years of scholarship and opinion about that, which means, I mean, whether or not you're concerned about when Shakyamuni lived exactly is less a concern to those who follow the Lotus Sutra and Nichiren's doctrine. We're more concerned about, well, where does this place Nichiren in the scope of the fifth 500-year period after Shakyamuni's death? If you've got a slush fund of 400 to 500 years, that Mappo, when Mappo begins, starts to, it gets close, yeah. So, you know, what form of Buddhism would be best suited to the coming days of the degeneration was a question which had occupied the thought of many Buddhist leaders since the 9th century, right? When is this final period of, not final, but what a lot of them called it the final period, but Shakyamuni had said, in the fifth 500-year period after my passing, the Lotus teaching will be in danger of being lost. And it will take a spectacular individual to propagate, create a resurgence of, a support for this Lotus Sutra. It's critical. And that time period of that final 500-year period will establish the next 10,000 years of the propagation of Buddhism if it survives. So yeah, Buddhist leaders were, is this the period? Is this when we should be nervous? Is it right? What are we going to do? Saicho, or Dengyo, who founded a new center of Buddhism on Mount Hiei, near the then capital Miyako, in the beginning of the 9th century, meant the foundation to be a preparation for the approaching days of the third age. Third age, because even though Shakyamuni spoke of these 500-year periods, it was generally talked about, and even when we discuss it, we talk about the former day, the middle day, and the latter day in the 1,000-year periods. So when he says third period, he's saying we're dealing with the latter 1,000 years, 2 500-year periods. So Saicho situated his practice, returning the resurgence of Lotus Sutra teachings from Tendai in China through Miaolo and then to him as he went back and forth to China. And we read about that in the Gosho, right? So he establishes the Lotus Sutra platform in Japan. Now, Nichiren talks a lot in the Gosho about how that was disrespected or lost. It had to be reconstructed in different ways because of the leaders in Japan who failed to take on the proper mantle that Saicho or Dengyo had created. And so there was a lot of slippage around that. And then comes Nichiren to like wake everybody up and go, right? But he's in the last 500-year period. So where this 500-year period begins, right, it's a little sloppy. Approaching is the end of the age of the copied law, right, the middle period, and nigh is coming that of the latter law, the ripe time for the propagation of the unique truth expounded in the Lotus Sutra. Yep. Thenceforward, none of the leaders escaped the influence of the prophecy, and serious thought on the latter days was growing during the 11th and 12th centuries. And it was Nichiren who came to the front as the most ardent follower of Saicho, Dengyo, and was destined to encounter perils on that account. Because there were a lot of people well ensconced within the samurai state as religious advisors, right? Has that duality to this day. Look at the world today with all of its denials, or some outright, like the nations of Islam or Iran, right? Also their own brand of Islam, is a theocracy. It's actually run by a figurehead of religion, not government as secular. A lot of secular governments in the world, including the United States, claim to be secular, have laws on the books, the Constitution, that keeps them apart, and yet many, many, many politicians in this country have been culled from the ultra right-wing, ultra Christian fascist nutbags, are now in control of many parts of government. So we end up with a theocracy in the cloak of governance, and it's causing a lot of problems. You know, look at Roe v. Wade being overturned. It's a direct link to the theocracy movement in this country. But, you know, the United States isn't alone in that. It's all over the world, isn't it? Good or bad, I'll let you be the judge, but it's obvious, isn't it? So in Nichiren's day, not only is this fact, but it's being enforced by the militia, by samurai. You don't believe like the government does, we'll just chop your head off and have a beer. Yeah. It's pretty intimidating, I think. All right. So, when Nichiren appeared in public with his cry of warning, 200 years had passed since the supposed beginning of the latter day. Now, you know why he says supposed beginning, because of that flux, right? But Nichiren is at the beginning of Mappo. Whether it's at the very beginning or a few hundred years after the beginning, he's situated in our modern era, the fifth 500-year period declared by Shakyamuni, yes? The vicissitudes of the rising and falling clans, wars within the country, right? My samurai will take your land. We want it. You're not following what we want you to do with it, so we'll just take it. Right? This militia government. By the Minamotos, that was the biggest clan, seemed to manifest the dangerous signs of the time. The irremediable, I'm not familiar with that word, I can't even say it, irremediable corruption of the hierarchies gave clamorous testimony to the decline of the teachings, which he refers to as the religion. We know Buddhism isn't a religion, but it was practiced as a religion by many groups. So this is part of the confusion in Buddhism, yes? The history of it, anyway. Let us consider the political and religious conditions against which Nichiren stood forth as a warning prophet. So, this is interesting. We're going to see this guy is writing about the context of Nichiren's lifelong commitment to Buddhism, yes? And what it was like to do that in a military government in medieval Japan. Early in the 13th century, the power of the ruling clan Minamoto passed gradually into the hands of their usurping major domos, the Hojo family. The latter ruled with the modest title of shiken, or commissioners, with the puppet dictatorship ostensibly over them. Right? You got to remember, this military clan grew out of a society and a culture that had at its head an emperor for years and years and years, centuries, yeah? And the emperor in any country, Eastern or Western, was always, or kings, if you will, in the West, were always seen as somehow closely related to deities, the gods. In other words, these leaders were imbued with some kind of holiness, extra terrestrial, if you will, guidance from these mystical forces. So from emperor to a hierarchy of totalitarianism, the head clan, the head dictatorship was seen to have some of this cultural support, some kind of almost deification, yes? So to rebel against them was more than just rebelling against governmental structure, is what I'm pointing out. All right. But their modesty, in the eyes of those who regarded them as usurpers, merely a means to their ambition, the ambition to secure popularity, something I talk about all the time in the struggles for who's going to get close to the government, which sect, which teacher, who are motivated by the power and the security of being in tight with the leaders, motivated a lot of teachers of surely Buddhism, but of every walk of life, yeah? If you were a merchant, you wanted to be the king's merchant, the emperor's merchant, the head clan's merchant, yeah? You want to protect yourself and your family. And their equity, but a method of solidifying their rule. Because if I'm in tight with the government, then I can hold sway over large swath of the people. Indeed, the Hojos understood how to sacrifice everything in titulo to the power de facto and to become the real rulers of the nation by pushing aside the imperial family and titular dictator. So once they were in tight with that organization, they could hold their own kingdoms in a way, yeah? A firm peace was established and economic conditions prospered, but there was something lacking in it. There prevailed a feeling among the thoughtful minority that the country of the gods was not being actually ruled by its legitimate rulers, the descendants of the sun goddess. See, there was a breaking. I mean, you have to understand the psychology of having lived in a culture that felt as though it existed through the beneficent gods of the sun, right? The land of the rising sun, the emperor being the child of the sun goddess. And now you have this military rule that kind of usurps the throne from the holy to the secular. That doesn't, even if you accept that as a Japanese citizen, every now and again you have to think, are they the real rulers? Did they just take ownership and we don't do anything for fear of being beheaded, right? Not that we would have been beheaded any less by the emperor, but that would have been the gods judging us, not these, right? So there's doubt, there's seeds of unrest. And this is the state of Japan in medieval Japan. Some would take that to arms. Some would just be uneasy. There would be dis-ease amongst the populace at all. What is it? Come on. Levels of society. Okay? So there prevailed a feeling among the thoughtful minority, those who gave thought to it. A lot of people just, don't talk to me about it. I'm just farming my animals. Leave me alone. Right? But the thoughtful minority, those that would actually openly talk about this, that the country of the gods was not being actually ruled by its legitimate rulers, the descendants of the sun goddess. Availing themselves to this unexpressed dissatisfaction, the imperial party framed a plot against the Hojos in 1221, a few months before the birth of Nichiren. So this is what Nichiren's going to be born into, a country of great unrest with battles for the very spirit of the nation. The plot was defeated, and the commissioner government dared to banish prominent members of the imperial family to remote islands and to put an infant on the throne. Thus the Hojo power was consolidated and immensely increased, although these rulers still retained the modest title of commissioner. We want to appear humble, but don't you cross us. The resentment of the discontented patriots only grew deeper in consequence of the forcible suppression of the movement, but politically their cause had already been hopelessly lost. We tried a major rebellion. We were summarily beaten, a lot of death, a lot of bloodshed, and the leaders were sent to die on Sado or Ito or wherever. It was under these circumstances that Nichiren appeared on the public platform as a spokesman of the patriotic cause, whose utterances were deeply tinged with religious fervor. Now this is an important thing to keep in mind because, as I've discussed in my readings of the Gosho, there are to this day sects of Nichiren who practice Nichiren's doctrine of Buddhism for the express purpose of saving the nation. And Nichiren did his best to support that with his Rishoan Kokuran, his remonstration against the Kamakura government at the time, and how they needed to adjust the way they treated the people and themselves in the practice of the correct practice of Shakyamuni's Buddhism, of the Lotus Sutra, not any other sutra, but that being the culminating sutra. He was very vocal about it. We know all the Gosho we've talked about, yes? But understand that there's a very core sector of the Japanese populace that still retains that ancient history of this is the nation of the gods. And it's not just for the Japanese citizens to get their head right around the superiority of Japan, but the rest of the world as well. Why do you think the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and other places in the world in World War II? The religious fervor of Japan, supported by the teachings of Buddhism. Now that's very twisted, but understand that sect still to this day very much alive. So there's so many influences around Nichiren, right? You have to consider the culture. He declared that the nation would be ruined unless the fundamental principle of the national life should be restored. That is, unless the people were governed by rulers legitimate both in title and authority. And how do you legitimize their life and authority? Herein lay the national standpoint of his religious ethics, or Buddhist ethics. And this plea attracted to his teachings many warriors who were imperialists in principle or covert malcontents against the existing regime. This was also the reason why the Hojo government, as we shall presently see, treated the clamorous Protestant as a traitor. So you see, you might get the impression when you first start learning about Nichiren's doctrine of Shakyamuni's Buddhism that his persecutions were all the result of his Buddhist practice. But you can see in the context here, yeah, his Buddhist practice upheld his dignity of the way things should be in life, absolutely. But the government on the other side, the ruling classes, the elite, they didn't care so much about Buddhism. I mean, that was just a vehicle of populist control for them, just as it is today. Religion is used as a methodology for governing people all throughout the world, as it was then. The elite didn't really give a crap about the religious aspect other than it gave them power and sway over everyone. That was important. So there was an uncomfortable relationship there. But their lust for power and control was very intolerant. And so Nichiren, getting popular with all this talk couched in Buddhism, which was for Nichiren the whole reason of his existence, to the government was just an annoying pest. He's damaging our control over people. He's assaulting our supremacy. Very egotistical, not religious at all, right? So let's get rid of that annoying little pest. Shut him up. Either kill him, and if you can't kill him for whatever reason, we're going to send him off to die somewhere in some cold wilderness. We need to get rid of this problem. That was Nichiren's life, the context of his life. He wasn't so much threatened by his preaching of Buddhism, but behind his preaching of Buddhism was the assault on the power of the ruling clans. So from a strictly power ego standpoint, Nichiren had to go. Right? Turning to another matter, the religious conditions, Nichiren saw similar evils closely connected with the political and social disorders. Yeah, because they're intertwined, right? The far-reaching plan of Dengyo, the reformer of the 9th century, for establishing the center of Japanese Buddhism on Mount Hiei and unifying its church organization, and we know, these words, church and and religion. They're Western terms that this author is using to entreat our cultural norms, but they're misleading, right? Because there's no Buddhist church. I mean, I established this school, the Kwun, specifically with that ancient Chinese word Kwun, to indicate that it's a place of practice and study, not a steeple to any gods, right? That aside. So he's saying that Dengyo's vision of setting up that central temple region of practice and study for Buddhism was partially realized, right? But even this partial attainment of the ideal of a state-organized place of study and practice was of merely temporary duration, because the relations established between this place of practice and study, hierarchy, and the government bureaucracy had a corrupting influence on both of them. The elite could see how they could use the teachings of Buddhism to sway the populace easily while intimidating them with power. And the church or the religious establishments, not Dengyo so much as some of his disciples and certainly others outside of that temple construct or place of practice and study, could see that there was to their advantage with lands, power, wealth, to be associated with the might of the government, the military. So both of them got corrupted, right? To maintain some sort of a alliance, if you will. The centralization of government and the consequent accumulation of wealth in the capital were concomitant with the development of ecclesiastical power and the growth of a secular aims and motives amongst the clergy. Something that I've repeated ad nauseum while I was talking about the Go Show. Well, here it is in this text, right? More than a century old. The scholars knew that about, the Japanese scholar knew that about the history of Japan. The government fell into the hands of the Fujiwara oligarchy, who now became the supporters of this temple region, and its rituals and mysteries, because it wasn't all Lotus Sutra. There were other players. We learn about that through Nichiren. And the priesthood, the monkhood, degenerated into tools of the ambitious aristocrats by promising them the supernatural aid of religion and by supplying them with elaborate ceremonies for the gratification of their over-refined tastes. So you see, there was a melding between the teachings and the influence of the Buddhist teachers at the time and the hierarchy, and they started to create Buddhist ceremonies to edify themselves, again, to appease the people who didn't have an emperor anymore, to signify that these power players were somehow imbued with the wisdom of the gods. And the churches, or I'll call them churches now because that's what we're talking about now, went along with it. So there's a very diseased relationship now between what should be very clear Buddhist teachings, which are muddied and really destroyed in many ways, and the power mongers, the dictatorial families that want to exercise power over the wealth and the populace of the nation. And Nichiren's growing up in the midst of this. He's studying Buddhism and Shakyamuni's teachings, and he's looking at what's happening around him, and he's going, holy crap, this is definitely the age of the loss of the teachings. It's obvious. The Lotus Sutra is going the way of Time magazine. It's become just so much fodder for justifying all this other crap, this other power play ego behavior. That's totally not Buddhism. It must have driven Nichiren kind of nuts, yeah? So of course, that kind of anxiety fed his fervor. No, you will not do this. So yeah, Nichiren is a very big historical figure in that sense. He would not back down. The chief cause of the degeneration of the Buddhist church lay, as Nichiren thought, in its promiscuous adaptation of Shingon mysticism. Right? The Gosho, he writes a lot about that. A form of Buddhism contaminated with Hinduism and other alien elements. Hinduism. Why is Hinduism marked specifically by this author? Because of this idea of another land, of reincarnation. None of that is Buddhism. It's completely antithetical to Buddhism. It's in the first teachings of Shakyamuni that he got, no, there's no such thing as a soul or an eternal self or none of that. That's magical, mystical thinking. Buddhism is about right here and now. How do you live your life maximally without suffering through your attachments to things and experience life as it's happening? How do we do that? Stop thinking about I'm going to go to this special place where everything's heavenly. Stop it. Stop the magic. Stop the mystics. How are you living your life right now? This is what Buddhism is about. This is what Shakyamuni was about. This is what he discovered. And Nichiren is discovering this for himself as a student. And he's looking around at all this. Oh, we got mystical things now. And if you just do this one day, it'll be okay. What? That's not Buddhism. What are you doing? Nichiren's upset, yeah? So here he is. This author is showing you the context of Nichiren's teachings. It was this admixture that appealed to the court nobles and supplied them with brilliant spectacles and occult mysteries. Because now, we got people believing in all of this mysticism. We can rightfully claim our imbued lives of the gods so that they don't question us. We can do as we please, and they will all go, oh yes, right? It was this secularization or vulgarization of the practice that had obscured the high ideals of Dengyo and reduced his institutions on Hie to instruments of greed and vice. It's scary when you think of how close Buddhism just came to disappearing on this planet. It did disappear in India, remember. Even after the fall of the Fujiwara nobles, the supporters of Mount Hiei, this religion of occult rites exercised its influence far and wide among the people at large through the superstitious practice of magic and sorcery. I'm so pleased to read this, so you know it's not just me saying it. Therefore, Nichiren's bitterest attacks were directed against this corrupt religion and its center at Mount Hiei. And I think it's right to call it religion at that point because it was based on magic and sorcery. Mysticism. That's not Buddhism. He firmly believed, Nichiren, that the sole way to restore Dengyo's religion consisted in adhering faithfully and exclusively to the scripture of the Lotus of Truth. Right? The Lotus Sutra. Namo Myoho Renge Kyo. Myoho Renge Kyo is the title of the Threefold Lotus Sutra, of the Lotus Sutra. Sadharma Pundarika Sutra, the Indian, right? Where are we time-wise? We'll go a little bit further. Another form of Buddhism in which Nichiren saw a curse was the worship of Amida Buddha, the Nembutsu. And boy, have we read a lot in the Go Show in Nichiren words about that very problem. This was a special development of Buddhist faith, which emphasized the simple-hearted devotion to Amita, the Buddha of infinite life and light, the Lord of the Western paradise. This worship seemed to Nichiren to be a desertion of the Buddha Shakyamuni, the genuine founder of Buddhism and the Lord of the universe, as he was revealed in the Lotus of Truth. The teaching of salvation by the all-redeeming grace of Amita Buddha, he says gospel, appropriate, had crept into the institutions of Hiei, Mount Hiei, and later produced an independent sect through the personal inspiration of the pietist Honen, and by its appeal to the distressed hearts and the turbulent times toward the end of the 12th century. Amita Buddha was, in the eyes of Nichiren, nothing but a usurper of the true dignity of Buddha, and the piety of multitudes toward the supposed savior, but a manifestation of the hysterical tendency of the age. Nichiren boldly declared that those who believed in this usurper were destined to fall into the nethermost hell, while the Shingon mysticism was denounced by him as a religion that was ruining the vitality of the nation. Well, we read that in Nichiren's words, didn't we? And as you'll recall, this whole Amida Buddha thing is about living an extra secular life, that beyond death you could go to this new land, just another way of describing what we in the West will call heaven, and be with all this joy. And so you're dead. Well, yeah, but to people living under this kind of stress, the idea that they could leave all this stress and go to another place to attain enlightenment, I'll buy that. I'll buy that for $1. Yeah. It's very infantile thinking, and it takes advantage of people through fear, right? The more fear you have for your very life in every moment of every day from a great, powerful government or institution or whatever that you're powerless to defend yourself, you forget that your mind is your own. And so as a desperation, you start to do as they tell you. Chant Amida Buddha. And Nichiren saw this as the very dagger that was about to kill off the teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha, as culminating in the Lotus Sutra. These people, because of their desire for power, for wealth, for both, were driven to create this mysticism out of a teaching that was everything else away from mysticism. But mysticism has a great influence of ego. And so they turned Buddhism against itself. This is why Nichiren is notable. He refused to let that happen. And that leads to a lot of correlations with Shakyamuni's teachings of thousands of years prior that Nichiren could identify with and actually called it out in the words of Shakyamuni in the Gosho. So anyway, very interesting read so far, yeah? I hope you're enjoying this. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I don't know if hitting the notifications button helps with the Lotus or the YouTube algorithms. I really don't. I know that subscribing and liking videos does help the algorithm. I don't know how notifications work. If they work for you, use them. That's up to you. In the meantime, you have to know from the links on this video that you can get the audio versions of this. You can support this channel financially through TLK at patreon.com, yeah? Or directly. There's all kinds of links on the Threefold Lotus.com or threefoldlotus.com the website. It's all free there. There's a lot of information there. Let me know. It looks like from the amount of views that this series on Nichiren's life is going to be a popular one. So I'm really happy that I'm able to provide this for you. Keep your practice strong and deliberate, right? Be kind to yourself, take care of your health, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.